Author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
What happens when the Constitution comes into conflict with progressive ideology? When the mere presence of a conservative is considered a threat to a safe space or to a carefully curated and ultimately frail worldview? Well, these are challenges that would have been thought ridiculous just a few years ago. But today, in this sensitive, brave new world, offense is deemed criminal and opposing ideas are apparently quasi-fascist. Dennis Prager, he said, quote, "The combination of modern hyper-parenting and left-leaning professors and administrators has allowed students to remake universities into large-scale editions of the island in Lord of the Flies." End quote. And he was right. The hunt, the derision, the violence that follows from the supposedly tolerant lashing out at all those who disagree with their idea of what the world should be is not just an occurrence. It's become commonplace. William Golding, he wrote his novel Lord of the Flies, and he said, "Fancy thinking the beast was something you could hunt and kill. You knew, didn't you? I'm part of you. Close, close, close. I'm the reason why it's no go, why things are what they are." End quote. And he concluded with a thought that should shake us all, especially those who favor this progressive intolerance. It was the stark moment when the lost children came to the realization that, quote, "maybe there is a beast. Maybe it's only us." End quote. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we're asking why podcast host and media sensation Ben Shapiro is considered a harmful presence in the halls of the progressives, why the New York Times is starting a news desk that monitors what it calls right-wing media. We'll also be asking why answers to where the funding for Joe Biden's student loan giveaway comes from and what impact such largesse will have on the broader economy. And we'll be talking liberty with Scott Cosenza as yet more challenges to the First Amendment rock America. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Hastings, Michigan on WBCH 1220 AM and 93.1 FM. Thank you for being here. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Jack the Ripper, the Marquis de Sade, son of Sam and Ben Shapiro. Yes, you heard that right. Ben Shapiro is now the boogeyman of the left. What has happened to this soft-spoken and quick-spoken presenter who has the left in such a tizzy? Well, to join us on that, we're joined by Liberty Nation's editor-in-chief, Miss Lisa K. Donner. Thank you ever so much for being here, Lisa.
Hi, Mark. That's got to go down as one of the best introductions in a while.
Well, yeah, poor Ben Shapiro. So I think everybody's familiar with Ben Shapiro. He's the top man over at the Daily Wire. He's very much in the conservative camp. And he really is one of the most inoffensive and well-spoken people around. So why is he now the boogeyman of the left?
Well, this is really funny. So last week, there's a group called the Podcast Movement. It holds a national conference every year, kind of like an expo. And the 2022 expo was held in Dallas, Texas. And the Daily Signal, which Mr. Shapiro co-owns, plunked down $10,000 to get their own booth, right?
Right,
Sounds
yeah, pretty normal.
Kind of normal, right. Well, and let me just say it makes sense for them to do that because Shapiro's podcast has about 15 million downloads a month.
Yeah, I mean, Shapiro and Joe Rogan, they're both big beasts in the podcasting world. There's no doubt about it.
Exactly. I mean, his program's a blockbuster. So anyway, Shapiro decides to make a cameo. He comes into the conference. He goes to the Daily Signal booth. He shakes hands, signs a few autographs, takes a couple pictures with people that like his show, and then leaves. That's it. Nothing else.
All right.
Wow.
Now he did this while sporting a pair of matching golden AR-15s, presumably, Lisa.
Yeah, you would think. or a MAGA hat or something. Anyway, the fur began to fly. Somebody tweeted, "Hey, podcast movement, what the F? As a trans person, a queer person, as someone with a uterus, this does not make me feel welcome. This does not make me feel safe." Well, without so much as a beat, the organizers of the event, the podcast movement, tweeted the following, and I've got to read this to you because you're not going to believe it. So this is the podcast movement. "Hi, folks. We owe you an apology before sessions kick off for the day. Yesterday afternoon, Ben Shapiro briefly visited the expo area near the Daily Wire booth. Though he was not registered or expected, we take full responsibility for the harm done by his presence." So it's
what
really
is the harm
incredible.
here? Do they detail what the harm is? Or is it merely someone's presence that is causing alleged harm?
Just his presence. Then they go on to say, and they had another tweet in between, but then they go on to say, just to clarify, no TDW, that's the Daily Wire representatives, were scheduled to appear on panels, and Shapiro remained in the common space and did not have a badge. If you have questions, we're here to talk. Thank you for reading, and we hope you enjoy us from here on out. So, people were wondering, is this a meme? Is this political humor? Are they kidding? I mean, Shapiro's very presence was found worthy of an apology.
Well, I think that's actually something that we're seeing a lot, aren't we? When people, like for example, when anybody on the conservative right, when they turn up, they get, as Maxine Waters suggested, they get shouted down, they get pushed back upon. And it's really become just a massive splurge of intolerance for any other views. And that really strikes me because this was a podcasting event. Now, podcasts, if they are anything at all, are an opportunity for all of us on all sides of the political spectrum to learn about new ideas, hear different opinions. And the fact that one of the big beasts of podcasting should be so unwelcome at an event that hosts and promotes podcast, doesn't that strike you as missing the entire point of the media?
Well, this is more from the so tolerant left, note sarcasm. The response from the right was very quick. The Federalist Molly Hemingway, who I have to say I disagree with her not very often. She tweeted, quote, "You sound like completely insane people. What in the world is wrong with you? Is this a joke? You couldn't tolerate Ben freaking Shapiro? Are you a child, an anti-Semite, an anti-Semitic child? How do you function in society if you can't tolerate Ben Shapiro?" That was just one of the best responses we had.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard Ben Shapiro do anything other than argue his point with reason. Now, you may not agree with his points, but he's hardly a dangerous figure unless you consider ideas dangerous.
Well, it's interesting because the libertarian magazine Reason came up with, are we getting into crazy territory if the mere presence of a mainstream conservative podcaster triggers apoplexy? I mean, this does not bode well for the future, Mark.
No.
Are we going to come to the day when conservatives have to go off the plane, off the bus, can't sit at the lunch counter, got to have separate bathrooms? I thought we've been there, done that.
Yeah, it really does seem that behind the fake tolerance, there's really a regressive mindset there, which is all about exclusion, hate, and bias. Yeah. So where does it go from here? Has Ben Shapiro reacted to this? And do you think that podcasters who would ordinarily have booths at this event, do you think they'll be thinking about spending their money elsewhere?
Well, look, Shapiro is a class act. I mean, he really handled this very well. He didn't, make a spectacle of himself, and he could have. I mean, but I think this speaks to the segregation, the politics of segregation. Segregating people based on their political beliefs. It's just a road we don't want to travel, and I think people being triggered by someone else's mere presence when they didn't have anything to do with them, it's just really beyond the pale. It would be funny if it weren't so sad.
There are no safe spaces from ideas. Lisa K. Dunner, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
And we'll be right back with Lisa after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Lisa K. Donner, editor-in-chief of LibertyNation.com. Now, Lisa, I want to talk a little bit about a new right-wing media watch segment that's coming up in the paper of record, the New York Times, The Grey Lady. Apparently, if you ever wanted to know what the other side think, now's your opportunity. What's happening?
Well, it's interesting. For years and years and years, the New York Times and other such legacy media outlets just ignored the burgeoning alternative media. Some are conservative, some are just alternative. Everything from blogs to very well run sites. They just decided just ignore them. They don't exist. Well, as everyone knows, the newspaper business is really in a lot of financial trouble. And lest we forget, the newspaper business is a profit-making enterprise. It always has been. And I think what's happening is the alternative media and maybe some conservative sites are cutting into the Times. So their idea was, okay, let's not ignore them anymore. Let's review them. Let's police them. Let's, call them out or whatever. So they started a new desk, and it's the New York Times political desk that focuses on their so-called American right-wing media.
All right. Now, is this really a way of them looking into seeing what the other side thinks and then reporting it so they can do their job as journalism? Or is it really just a way to try and denigrate the right and get a few more clicks from their faithful audience?
Well, why don't we start with who they hired to head up this new news desk at the New York
Always
Times.
follow the top spot. Yeah, go for it.
So the top spot, the political editor of this new desk, goes to Ken Benzinger, who you might not heard of, but his LinkedIn page says he's worked for the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, for Variety as a Mexico correspondent. But his claim to fame is working on the BuzzFeed team that published the Steele dossier on January 10th, 2017, in an unverified report that contains errors, air quotes, their words, not our words.
So we can see where this is going. The guy who's running the whole show over there at the New York Times essentially created the biggest false flag news story of the century by publishing unverified report that contains errors, as you point out, and then starting this whole Russiagate collusion scandal. How does anybody hire somebody who has such a major faux pas on their record?
Well, here's the kicker, Mark. This is really interesting. In announcing Benzinger's appointment and announcing the new news desk, the editor of politics, I believe he's a senior editor at The Grey Lady or the New York Times, David Halfinger, said, quote, "These articles will focus on people who reject mainstream narratives and question the institutions that hold up our democracy." Hello? I thought that's what the fourth estate was supposed to be doing all along.
Yeah, it's almost as though they haven't realized that the journalist's job is to question or reject mainstream narratives and find out what's really behind something. But now they're focusing on the people who do that. So are they doing investigative journalism into investigative journalists? Is that what we're looking at?
I guess, they feel like it's important to investigate, to be skeptic of the other media outlets rather than being skeptics of the government.
Right. Again, that's an issue that's much broader. And let's just poke a little toe into those waters. Obviously, we have the White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, and she recently said that people don't walk across the borders. Now, the right-wing media, as we should call it for just now, the right-wing media reported that Karine Jean-Pierre apparently doesn't believe that people walk across the borders. But in the left-wing media, nary a word was said. How do you explain
Well,
that?
I mean, the facts are all you have to do is turn on the TV. Every day, it's like a drumbeat of people coming across the border. Every day, there's a drumbeat of these people being delivered to New York and Washington, D.C. We know this is happening because our own eyes tell us that it's happening. So to ignore it, and I personally reject this business about right wing, right wing, right wing. I mean, it's okay to be a conservative site. We Liberty Nation markets itself as a conservative site. We don't consider ourselves right wing. We consider ourselves, people who question authority, no matter the reason power. That's the business of a good, solid, free press, which we don't seem to have anymore, which is why so many of these alternative outlets have popped up.
Yeah, it's like there's a blooming of alternative outlets there. Now there are some on the political left, some on the political right, some on the political center, and they're all kind of growing, and they're growing their own organic audiences. And at the same time, what we're seeing is an exodus from what we would term, I guess, the mainstream media. Obviously, we've seen ratings drop precipitously for the Rachel Maddow slot that was. We've seen Brian Stelter kicked to the curb to much sadness, I believe.
And next up is Chucky Todd. It looks
Yes.
like he's on the ropes.
Yeah, it seems that the old vanguards of the mainstream who have spent years telling us that, theirs is the only opinion to trust. Theirs is the way forward. They are the, if I may, reliable sources. And now their audiences are leaving them. Many of them are being shown the door, perhaps because they're failing to keep the audience. And the new king of late night is not Jimmy Kimmel. It's
Greg Gutfeld.
Greg Gutfeld. I mean, who saw that coming a couple of years ago?
Yeah, I can tell you as editor-in-chief of Liberty Nation, we make a concerted effort to ratchet down the vitriol, offer the facts, give some intelligent analysis. We openly state we're conservative. We urge the New York Times to openly state what it is and what its bent is. I think that would be fair to everybody reading it, instead of trying to be a wolf in sheep's clothing and act like, they need to police us.
The wolves are indeed at everybody's door. Lisa K. Donna, thank you ever so much.
Very welcome, Mark.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation from 2 to 3 p.m. Sunday on KBKW, 103.5 FM, 1450 AM, the talk of Grays Harbor. Later on, we're talking Liberty with Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott D. Cosenza, to delve into the latest attacks on free speech in America. But up next, after this short break, we're joined by economics guru Andrew Moran, discussing not only where the money comes from to pay for Joe Biden's student loan largesse, but also what impact this boondoggle will have on the broader economy. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
It's been more than a week since President Biden unveiled his plan to forgive student loan debt to the tune of either $10,000 or $20,000, depending. And yet, despite persistent questions from the more right-leaning media, the administration refuses to commit to saying where the money is coming from. Now, to delve into the numbers and the economic impact of this magnanimous offer from the President of the United States, we're joined by economist and author, Mr. Andrew Moran. Welcome back to the show, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
So, Andrew, let's get right down to this. Somewhere down the line, it's the taxpayer who foots the bill, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, taxpayers are going to pay for the student loan forgiveness plan, but it's not just today's generation of taxpayers; it's tomorrow's generation as well. Because you have to remember, a lot of the student loan forgiveness, it's going to be based on deficit finance spending. Because no way is the government going to say, okay, we're going to raise taxes to cover up the deficit that's going to happen by all this additional spending. Because President Biden, he already admitted that, okay, yes, it's going to probably erase some of the deficit reduction that he has, part of the Inflation Reduction Act. But overall, I mean, everyone's going to pay for this today, tomorrow, 10 years from now. That's how taxation works, because or government spending works, because every time government spends something, it doesn't just raise taxes. It turns on the printing press, it sells bonds, and just relies on continued on both parties deficits.
I wonder what people think, how people think this will actually end, because Joe Biden he promised this before he became president, and he has delivered on it. So for some people, that's a promise made, promise kept situation. But what about the people who started college this year? Will they not be thinking, well, these people, my predecessors had 10,000 forgiveness, 20,000 forgiveness. Aren't they going to want the same incentive?
Exactly, and that's how student loan debt forgiveness incentivizes constantly delaying it. I mean, if I'm going to try to pay the very bare minimum because I see my former colleagues getting that $10,000 or $20,000 student loan forgiveness, then I'm just going to say, okay, I'm going to pay the bare minimum. I'm not going to work hard. I'm not going to depend on my parents to help pay for part of my tuition. I'm going to wait for the government to step in once again and say, okay, fine. Yesterday's class got $10,000. Now tomorrow's class can get $10,000. And then when you see the progressives, and progressives are already complaining that the $10,000 or $20,000 is not enough. You saw a couple of people saying, okay, it needs to be $50,000. And that's the next step. There's no doubt about it. If the Republicans win in 2024, then the Democrats campaigning will say, you know what, we're going to promise paying $40,000. And then just adds fuel to the fire. Nothing gets done. And then the GOP is bad because they don't address the root causes of higher education, how it's in shambles. So this problem is just going to fester, not go anywhere until there's actually a financial crisis or a fiscal crisis in the United States. But who knows, with the Federal Reserve is, if they just bail out everybody, this would be a perpetual problem that'll never go away.
A perpetual problems. It's one of the few things that science denies can happen. A perpetual motion machine. Well, Joe Biden's just invented it.
Well, what's funny is that there was a great book. I forgot the name. Of the title. It's about this. It was Isaac Asimov book, and they developed this perpetual motion machine, and everyone had this free energy forever. And then they discovered that there's a price to pay for that. The universe is going to collapse, and that's the way government policy works. That you have this routine, endless deficits, debt, money printing, but eventually the house of cards have to come down. The earth has to get sucked into that black hole eventually, but when that happens, who knows?
Let's discuss the free market implications on this. Now, am I right in thinking that universities and colleges across America, if they can see that the burden of $10,000 or $20,000, or in fact, just being able to pay 5% of your discretionary income over a period of years, if that's incentivizing people to perhaps go to college, or to not pay the debts and then wait for the government to pay it off, will these colleges not just put up their rates anyway and think, well, the government's going to suck it up at the end of the day and we're going to get our money? So they're going to put more pressure on the loan users, the loan borrowers, by adding prices to it, because we saw that happen, didn't we, with the tax credit for electric vehicles, $7,500 tax credit further down the line. The very next day, I believe it was, the electric vehicle companies put up their price between $6,000 and $8,000.
Yes, absolutely correct. This has been the main problem with post-secondary education for years. The reason why tuition is so high and why it exceeds so many other goods and services in the broader economy is that you have these government-backed student loans, $1.75 trillion worth. In these college universities, they're not incentivized to cut spending. They're not incentivized to trim their budgets, not be so opulent, and not hire thousands of diversity training officers. That when the government just gives them these guaranteed student loans, that incentivizes them to keep spending and keep raising tuition and keep exacerbating the problem. So that is one of the root causes that the GOP is not focusing on. And what's funny too is that when Joe Biden was vice president, he even admitted this. He admitted that student loans have exacerbated or contributed to the student loan debt crisis. But nobody's willing, I guess it's not politically feasible, but nobody's willing to address that problem. And I doubt it ever will.
Yeah, it seems that they're willing to call out big pharma, big tech, but never big education.
Of course, because that's their constituents. The the Democrats, they're all, the college, the professors, they lean overwhelmingly Democrat. College graduates overwhelmingly lean Democrat, and that's their base. So of course they're gonna maintain the status quo.
So Andrew, I think the big story this week is not so much that there is such a thing as student loan debt forgiveness, but rather how the administration, the White House, they're being so coy about who's going to pay for it down the line. Now, we know that it will be the taxpayer eventually. Everybody understands this, but they're refusing to put those words into print, as it were. What could be the reason for this?
Well, I think they're primarily focused on just whataboutism, because if supposedly if you took a PPP loan, then you shouldn't be complaining about student loan debt forgiveness. I think that's the public relations tactic.
Let's jump into this a second, Andrew.
Yes. Okay.
So yeah, this was the automatic response. So instead of saying making the case of why student loan debt forgiveness is going to be so good for young Americans and young American families, what they did instead was went after the critics, specifically a series of Republicans, even though Democrats did it as well. But they pointed out that, well, here's the Republicans, and they're being hypocritical because they took out these, I believe, payment protection program loans. And I think this whole PPP situation has been used by the White House, expounded upon by the press, and nobody really has explained what it's for, what its purpose was, and who it benefited. Could you give us the breakdowns?
Yeah, it seems like voters have short-term memories. I mean, I was against the PPP loans because that was terribly rolled out. It was a waste of money. They kept adding to it, and it was deficit finance spending once again. But PPP had a different purpose. The government forced these companies to shut down. They shut down the economy. They told these companies you had to close your doors, but if you keep your payroll intact, they're going to give you this money, and then it's going to be forgiven. That's completely different than voluntarily going to a college, enrolling in lesbian dance theory, and spending $50,000 on a job you're never going to have. So I think those are two completely different things. And also, just to reverse on your previous point, it should be pointed out too that a lot of the taxpayer focus on this is that it's going to benefit mostly the wealthy. I mean, this is not so much student loan debt forgiveness. It's a reallocation of wealth. It's a wealth transfer, because most college graduates, they earn $125,000 or more, and they vote Democrat. So I think that's important to mention also, that because the Democrats like to say, the Republicans are just for the wealthy and they hate students and poor people, but the poor people who are going to pay for the poor and middle income people are going to pay for this for tomorrow's wealthy Americans.
A final quick question for you, Andrew. Yes. I think many of the recipients of this largesse will be surprised to learn that this loan debt waiving is classed as taxable income in at least 13 different states. Now, has that been taken into the calculations? Because it really seems an aspect that the Biden administration is not keen to discuss.
Okay, well, so there's two things on this. First is that it could be taxed. I mean, there's 13 states right now. There's a mix of Republican and Democrat. It's highly doubtful that a state like Massachusetts is going to try to undermine a Democratic president's legislative agenda. Two is that this is going to probably contribute to inflationary aspects, in the sense that, now there's more money in the economy going to chase few goods. That's going to, raise the price of everything. So overall, I mean, if the states want to tax it, perhaps that would ease somewhat the inflationary aspect of that student loan debt forgiveness. But overall, I think it's more of a wait and see approach to see how states are going to tax the $10,000 or $20,000. But overall, I think it's safe to say that the Democrats are not going to do it, but the Republicans do it. It would contradict their principles, because you want less taxation, you want less government intervention into the private affairs of individuals. So I think it's just wait and see now what's going to happen.
Well, of course, there's no reason why a Democrat state wouldn't support a Democrat policy that would buy Democrat votes. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up after this short break, we're back with Scott Cosenza talking liberty. Free speech under attack once again. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
A significant win for a high school Christian group comes out of the Ninth Circuit and raises the question of competing ideologies at schools and college campuses across the United States. But was this a real First Amendment win? And does it have ramifications for other groups? Well, fortunately, we have constitutional attorney, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the Excellent Uprising podcast, and general man about town, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire, here to help us figure out the answers. Thanks for
It's
being here,
that
Scott.
last part, man, about town that I treasure the most, Mark. And thank you so much
Absolutely. I do hope you're living up to it. Now, so the details here, Scott. A Christian group at Pioneer High School in San Jose, California, has apparently scored a First Amendment religious freedom win. What are the details?
Well, that's right. The details are that the school officials wished to discriminate against the Fellowship of Christian Athletes group because they're hostile to their values and they hate them. And that what they were willing to do is establish rules requiring inclusivity for all student groups. Basically, you're not allowed to discriminate against people for characteristics that others find, improper to
Immutable
discriminate
characteristic hierarchy, yeah.
For anything. And then what they do or did do is ignore the discrimination that they found acceptable in other groups. So, for example, there was a group called the Senior Women's Group for not senior citizens, as the term is often used, but for seniors in the student body, and blatantly discriminating against men or males or people who identify as males in their membership. And basically like the club bylaws and things like that. But because they're favored, because their mission and their politics are elevated and celebrated by the administration and the teachers, they're allowed to continue discriminating. But when the Christian Fellowship decides that they want to discriminate against people who, by the way, this is not like somebody joined the group and didn't want to be had some negative issue. These are outsiders. These are fellow students at Pioneer who dislike, and also teachers and administrators who denigrate the mission and the faith, the professed faith of these students. On record, we have multiple instances of them, calling them charlatans, saying they're basically just. I mean, how many times can you say denigrating their faith? It's really disgusting what these public school teachers and administrators did regarding these students' religious faith, which is to say that they can't be funded. And the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled this week in a 3-judge panel ruling 2-1 that the school was issued a preliminary injunction. They are going to have to fund the Christian students just like they would if it were a group or mission they agreed with. It was a 2-1 vote on the panel. 2 Trump judges voted to
Trump-appointed judges, rather.
That's right. Two Trump-appointed judges voted to enjoin the school, rather, and prevent them from taking away the funding and requiring them to fund them. And a Obama appointee voted no. So the Ninth Circuit, of course, Mark, is radically liberal.
Yes, the Ninth Circus, as it's often referred to. So other than the staff and administrators and other students' reaction to the clubs, are there any distinctions between groups that are exclusionary, as you say? For example, all over the country, there are student black caucuses, religious caucuses, or Islamic groups, for example. Why is one frowned upon and the other not? Now, obviously, that's because of personal biases within the staff and the student bodies. But surely the people who are enforcing the laws within these school administrations, they must know that by allowing one and disallowing another, that they're being actively discriminatory against somebody's First Amendment rights. Surely they know this.
What people are able to delude themselves and convince themselves to be perhaps even, I'll just be more respectful and say that they've convinced themselves that that's not true. And what we see is that administrators throughout America, whether they're on the left or the right, often convince themselves that what they want to implement vis-a-vis restrictions on their students is somehow okay, when in fact the Constitution grants, it does not stop at the schoolhouse door, right? That's the famous line. And so you've posed it to me like, surely they must know. Well, either A, they know and they don't care because they're not going to have to pay out the the damage award when it eventually comes. It's just going to be a whoopsie. And also some of the powers that be in San Jose, notably, Mark, was the scene of perhaps one of the most violent reactions to a Donald Trump rally, where the local police allowed the Antifas and progressives to set upon the Trump rally attendees and commit horrible acts of violence against them without so much as a by your leave, because they favored that kind of lawlessness when directed at their political enemies, namely Donald Trump supporters. So for the administrator who discriminated in this fashion, Mark, it might not be a bug, but a feature for their career.
Could be a good career development move. Now, there's another story that I want to talk about, Scott, that has First Amendment implications. This comes out of Tennessee, I believe. The township put regulations on where citizens are allowed to organize, assemble, and protest, where and when they're allowed to do these things. Now, what are the details, and how many parts of the First Amendment does this breach?
Mark, these
like all of them.
It's I'm actually looking it up. It's Franklin, Tennessee, by the way.
Franklin, Tennessee.
And the city fathers there voted unanimously, by the way, to wrangle this First Amendment in a little bit. It was just so broad, all the freedoms that it gave.
Yeah, the freedom to assemble
and
freedom of expression. Oh, yeah, terrible.
Like, nobody wants to deal with that kind of thing when they're trying to tie one on after a long work week. And that's basically what the regulation says. They want the downtown area, Mark, to be free for commerce and the hardworking citizens to go and use the facilities of the local, the public houses and restaurants. And it's just not conducive to that kind of activity if you got a bunch of people petitioning for the redress of grievances. Also, Mark, the police have a harder time keeping track of people when it's nighttime. That's another thing that the city fathers noted. It's hard to argue with that.
So come on, let's cut to the chase here, Scott. It's unconstitutional, right?
It seems so blatantly unconstitutional. Now, there's one thing that kind of might make somebody think that it's not, and this is that the rule does not seem to target any specific type of demonstration or point of view. Okay, and oftentimes restrictions that are viewpoint neutral will get basically more latitude from the courts. But this kind of massive, just you can't protest at all, starting at 5 p.m. on a Friday until Saturday morning, and then again Saturday afternoon until Sunday morning. Like, you can't restrict things for those reasons. For instance, at nighttime, or for such broad carve outs. But because it is a time, place, and manner restriction, the Supreme Court has said that those aren't just unconstitutional as a matter of course, right? We have to take a look and see. And I think this one certainly will be ruled unconstitutional, but I think that perhaps the city fathers will see the error of their ways before spending the taxpayers' resources to defend a provision that really does seem to fly in the face of the Constitution.
Well, a free speech zone by its very definition is anti-First Amendment. Scott DiCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's almost all we have time for on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our guests, Lisa K. Donner, Andrew Moran, and Scott DiCosenza. And of course, extend my thanks to you, the listener, for being here with us. My parting shot for this week. Winston Churchill once noted, "When there is no enemy within, the enemies outside cannot hurt you." Now, one wonders what the outside enemies of America are thinking right now. They see the president call 70 million citizens semi-fascists. You have a New York state governor tell Republicans to be gone, to move away. And then there's an overarching feeling that those who do not toe the globalist line are just not welcome in their own country anymore. This government continues to make enemies of the very people it claims to serve. And the enemies outside, well, they must surely just be biding their time. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I can
others.
do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Getting noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.